Hi guys, this is Steve with a Mirror Maze tutorial. Tonight we're going to learn how to model up some aloe, an aloe plant. We're going to learn how to model it, texture, and animate this thing using the matrix extrude we're going to use, also spline dynamics, and then we're going to get into a little bit of subsurface scattering and some other techniques to texture this thing. It's pretty relevant too because today is Earth Day, so happy Earth Day. But anyway, let's check out the sample I made here. So this is the growing aloe plant. And the reason why I chose aloe, I did another sample previous to this with just regular leaves, just as a kind of a quick test. But this method will show off the matrix extrude, which maybe some of you aren't familiar with. And it's just a very powerful tool. It turns something into something that looks very complex to start into a very simple task. So we're going to get in and get started with that right now. So let's open up a new scene here. And we're going to select just a cube to start and shrink it down a little bit so that it's narrow. And now we're going to go ahead and make it editable and select our top polygon. So this is where we're going to add the matrix extrude. And to do that, you can press M and then X, if you look down in the list, is matrix extrude. So we're going to select that, MX, and you can see your options pop up and it goes to a default. So you have your steps of 8, and then it also has move, scale, rotate, all those options. And you'll see what they do shortly. So we're just going to change rotate to 0, and we're going to change our scale just so you can see what it does. We don't necessarily need to have the scale change, but it changes the scale per step, and it reduces it by the values that you input. So per step, this is going to reduce the initial scale by 98%. So to make your adjustments now that you have those parameters made, you will drag your mouse to the left or to the right to get them to register. And so once you do, don't unclick or click anywhere, just leave the top polygon selected, and you can go into these parameters now and readjust them. And as long as you don't deselect the top polygon, you can still change these in real time. So we don't need anything quite this tall for what we're doing. So you can go ahead and change move. So this is moving it along the Z axis here for the local. And we're just going to bring it down till it looks about right, and that looks fine. And steps of about 30 look good. And just to show you real quick, and if we weren't going to be using spline wrap or anything else to model up this leaf, we could use, that's going a little crazy, but we could use these parameters below to just adjust the rotation slightly. Super sensitive tonight, apparently. But you can, so you could model up some leaves or any kind of organic shape pretty quickly. So we're going to leave it at about these values, and that looks good. So the next thing we're going to do is build up those little spikes, and I'm just going to turn on my shading here so that I can see the line work. And actually, for these extrudes, we could go and select every other polygon along the side. What I would love to do is a loop selection around the whole thing, but how do you do every other? I found a really awesome plugin. So let's see, I installed it, should work. Let's see if I have it here. Oh, you know what? It actually didn't install for whatever reason. I don't think Yeah, okay. But anyway, there is a script out there that will select every other polygon, but let's get a little crazy and go through and just manually select these. I forget the name of the plugin, but if you do a quick search, you can find it. And we're just going to go through, select every other. Yeah, I'll have to go back and reinstall that because if you were to do this over and over, luckily we're only modeling one leaf. You definitely want that plugin. It's super helpful. So as you're clicking, just hold Shift down to select multiple. And if you accidentally select one that you don't need, just hit Control click and then hold back down Shift so you can continue selecting. And we're just gonna power through these, not too many left. Control click that. And there we go. There, that looks good. And just kind of rotate around, make sure you have selected what you need selected. And then we're gonna go ahead and use the matrix extrude again, so MX. And this time we only need about 3 steps, is pretty decent amount. And we're going to drag to the right just a hair. And again, you can adjust these parameters after. So as long as you get it out there, you're golden. So we'll just bring in the Z a little bit. And that looks pretty good now. So now what we need is the spike action. So I think a value of about 70% brings them in pretty good. And then also, there is the variation tab where you can do initial or per step, and we're going to do per step. So what that does is it really varies up these spikes, so it gives it a little bit more of a natural look. So those look pretty decent. And the next thing we're going to do is, since we're planning on bending this, and it doesn't look real pretty yet, but it will get there. We're going to slice this thing down the middle. So if you hit F3, that should bring you to your right view, depending on how you oriented your object. But we're going to hit MKK for the knife tool, and we're just going to want to do a loop selection right down the middle. Let me try that again. There we go. It's kind of hard to see because it was right on my y-axis, but there it is. And you can also see that we have some weird stuff going on with the shading with the Fong, so we can also adjust that if needed. If we reduce it to maybe like 45, it kind of clears things up a little bit. And we're going to add a hypernerb on top of that just to take a look and see what we have. So if we render that out real quick, we see that we have the spikes, and things are looking pretty good for the most part. Pretty decent, super quick. You can go ahead and refine your geometry if you want, but I think for the purposes of this tutorial, things are looking pretty good. So what we're going to do next is go ahead and add the bend deformer to this just to give it some shape. Because as you can see in the final render, these leaves, they're wrapping around each other so that it appears a little bit more natural. They're not all flat. So if they were all kind of bunched together, like as they do when they start, they just look like they're growing organically around each other. And in this sample here, you can kind of see that going on. This is a little bit more chaotic of a plant than the one I designed, but I just wanted something simple, neat, clean, something that illustrated these ideas. So next thing we're going to do is add the bend deformer to this. So go to bend, and it needs to be a child of our cube. And so once we have that, you can add a value in right away just to see what's going on. And it's bending in the wrong direction. So we're just going to rotate that around 90 degrees so that we get it bending in the proper direction, and then we're just going to keep the y-axis length. And we're also going to scale the bend down so that we get a tighter curve. Now it's looking pretty good. The other thing I might want to do is add a little bit of thickness to this. So if we uncheck the bend, we can do a loop selection right around the middle. So UL for loop, and make sure you're in your line mode over here. And if you hit T for scale, you can just scale up the middle just a little bit to give it that fat, juicy aloe-ness. Has a lot of juice in there. That's a good piece of aloe. So there we go. And just do a quick preview. It's looking pretty sweet. Yeah, so let's just keep going here. And the next thing we want to do is create the spline, the shape that we're going to wrap this around. So if we go into our front view, or one of your side views, front is fine. We're going to grab your Bezier spline tool, and we're just going to create a pretty good looking, it can be any shape you want or any direction you want, but and you can always go back and adjust this later. And on some previous tests, I've done this with hair. The thing I like about doing it with spline dynamics is that you have a lot of control right off the bat. You can draw your splines and control everything manually. And luckily, we just have to create this one spline, really, and we're just going to clone this thing, and it's going to create a whole plant for us. So it's pretty slick, pretty simple way to go about doing this. And just as a heads up, you may want it to start down and kind of arc outward instead of going straight up. You could totally animate it that way, but I found that this works pretty well. And also, for once we start cloning this, you can create multiple splines to vary this up, which you'll see in a minute. But we're gonna do a workaround that I think works pretty well. So here's our spline. Now the thing is, we're gonna want to subdivide this just a little bit. So if we select one point and select all and hit US, that will subdivide those points. And another thing we're going to want to do, let's just add spline dynamics to this so you can see what it's going to look like as it is, without me adjusting the spline type. So if you go into your hair tags, you'll see spline dynamics, and the first thing we're going to want to do is fix our points. So you can select your points and then set, and you'll see that the spline does its thing. Now it's looking real funky because it's got the wrong spline type. So we're seeing a lot of the interpolation of what these anchor points are creating, and it's not looking how we want it to look. So what we're going to do is change that to B-spline, and it smooths it right out, and it has a lot better movement. So it just looks much more natural. And so we have that selection. I think we're just going to keep this as it is. It's looking pretty good. So we're going to go back, F1 for perspective view, and we're going to wrap this piece of aloe around our spline. So to do that, we're going to select the aloe, and we're going to go to our list of different deformers here and choose Spline Wrap. And that is also going to be a child of our, let's call it aloe. And so the next step to this is, once it's a child, you basically just need to drag your spline into the spline parameter, and you'll have to change your axis that it's wrapping around. So we have the positive Y, and it's looking like it's dying right here. It doesn't look very happy, but this is where we want it to be for the moment. I mean, we're doing what we need to do, so everything's all good. So the next thing we want to do is, well, for the sake of later on, let's just center the axis of this spline. So that way when we clone it and move the spline around, it didn't seem to move. Oh, you know what? It's because I'm going to take spline dynamics off. There we go. There we go. Okay, so the axis is centered now. It was doing something funky because we had spline dynamics assigned to it. So I'm going to go ahead and add that back. And if you're out here, if your keyframes are way out to anything beyond 0 and you have spline dynamics on, you don't have a fixed point, it's your thing's going to start falling. So just go back to 0 and there it is. And we're going to select maybe the first 3 points like we did previously and just set the position. And there we go. All right, so now that we have everything in place, we're going to go ahead and rotate this spline around so that it's looking more how we want it to look. So the beauty of this spline wrap is that let's see. So the beauty of the spline wrap is that we can control the rotation of this. And so we can rotate it all around. And so for the moment, that will be fine. Sorry, I just realized I was recording this at a smaller resolution, but I think it will, you guys should be able to see everything. So that is good. And now what we can do is adjust the size so that the bottom is small. So it starts off at a point, kind of like our sample does, because we want it to just kind of sprout out from nothingness. And we'll also drag the top down. And to create a new point on your spline, you just control click and boom, you have your new point. So if we just rotate around, we can see what we have here, and it's looking pretty good. And you can adjust this to your liking. You can adjust the anchor points, push and pull them until you get the look that you want. So that may be pretty good for this. I'm just going to control click out a few more points, maybe bring this one down and angle this up so it gets fatter toward the top. Smooth these out. That might be what we're looking for. So, you know, these things are definitely things worth taking your time on and tweaking and getting them exactly how you want for whatever you're working on. But this is looking pretty good. So now, if you hit play, you can see this is deforming. It's moving nice and dynamically. So the next thing we have to do is clone. Do a radial array and get this thing looking like an aloe plant. So if we option click that will just automatically make everything a child of it. And we're going to go ahead and select Radial, and we're going to render instances for now. And we're going to choose the XZ plane so that they all show up next to each other. And look at that, they all popped into place starting at the center. So now we can see that they're kind of snug around each other. But we also at the bottom, I think, want a little bit more rotation, so we can go in and adjust our spline wraps rotation just so they start to kind of twist around one another. So they're kind of nested within one another. That's looking pretty good. And again, something you can tweak, and also you can adjust your bend on the fly, which is great. So you can always change that up if you want. I think it's looking pretty good, around 90 or 100. So there. That is our aloe plant. Check that out. That wasn't so painful. And if we hit play, we can see they're all kind of bouncing, doing their plant-like thing. So what's missing here, or this could be, you know, made to your taste, but I think what we want to do is add a little variation to the bounce of these, so that it, you know, because in nature things don't happen in sync like this. There's a lot of randomness to how things move when there's wind hitting it or turbulence. So a way to vary this, first of all, a way to vary everything will be to use the random effector, and that we're just going to use that to vary our scale. Random. So right off the bat, it selects position, but we're going to deselect that and choose uniform scale and just change that to a small value, maybe not even 0.2, maybe something like 0.1. So it changes up the look of this. So they're not all quite uniform. Now that's not going to change the fact that they're all falling together, but it's changing the scale, so that's a start. And we're also going to get into the time offset parameter down here, which is great for once we get this spline animated. But before we do that, we're actually going to just make 5 different versions of this super quickly. And how we're going to do that is we're going to take that out of the hypernerb, because I don't necessarily think we need it. I think we can, yeah, so we can throw it on top of our cloner. And I believe, let's see, I think that may alter the stack a little bit. We'll just keep it a child. We'll keep that hypernerb on there because we're going to need it for later. All right. So anyway, we're going to Option G to put that all within a null, and then with right underneath this null, but not inside of any of this, it can just go right in between. We're going to stick our spline. And we're going to change our radius back down to 0. So they all go back right into place where they were. And then what we're going to do next is just duplicate this. So Control, once you have it selected, Control and drag down and just make, we have 4, let's make 5 copies of this. So now they're all their own object, and they're still going to move at the same time, but that's what we're going to go ahead and fix right now. And what we really should have done is we should have animated the spline first, but we can just select them all and adjust all the parameters at once. So that's fine. And if we just right click, we can unfold all so we can have a look at everything here. So the next thing we're going to do is just go through these different spline dynamics tags, and we're just going to vary them all up a little bit. First of all, I guess the gravity is fine. It seems to be working just fine. These are pretty floppy pieces of aloe. I don't know. I think they're pretty stiff realistically, but you know, it's fine. Not everything has to be very very real. So we're just going to change the stiffness and the rubber values a little bit. Just vary them up 10%, 15%, just to add, you know, a little variation. Each one of these is an individual. They're all a little bit different. So maybe leave that one the same and then change the stiffness of this one to like 15 and 30. If you put the rubber too low, your geometry may blow up. But now you can see that they're all moving a little bit differently, slightly, subtly, but you know, that's pretty much what we're looking for. And you can adjust that until you're getting something closer to what you might want to see. But I think that's pretty close, pretty good. So the next thing we're going to do is grow this thing from nothing to the full-fledged aloe plant that we see now. So we're just going to select all of our spline wraps. And again, this is something we could have done before we duplicated this, but that's okay. It's not always perfect. So we have our endpoint selected, and we're just going to go because we know how the growth is going to end. And so we can just select a point out in our timeline. And I'll just choose 50 for now. That may be a little too slow, or 40. How about that? And we're going to control click the parameters that should be adjusted. And I believe we're going to control click to, I don't think we need to adjust the rotation at all. And I believe the only other one we need to do is the spline size. It just may be these two. You can get into the other ones if you want to make a more interesting kind of bloom out of this. You can also add, you could totally add constraints to one of the vertex points of your spline and have those controlled individually, so you can get the spline maybe blooming straight up and then it falls later on in its life. Or there are lots of different options. We can get into those maybe in another tutorial. There's just so much that you can do with all of this, but already this is a pretty powerful little setup. So we can control clicked all of our parameters. So we set our endpoint. Now let's go to 0. And now we're just basically going to drag all of these down to where they start looking like they're growing a little bit. So you can just adjust these, and most likely they're just going to be kind of zeroed out. Don't necessarily have to be, but you know, get it down to where it starts looking pretty good, at least smaller than what it was, and adjust the 2 parameter. So let's just make sure we control click to activate those, and we can see this thing grow. And I mean, already that's pretty good. We're really already seeing how well this thing grows, how quickly, how responsive it is. So why don't we just leave it there? I mean, we could really take all day, but let's not, for your sake and for mine, and continue to move forward here. So that's looking good. Now, how do we vary up the rate at which they grow? Well, that's where the random effector comes back into play, and we're gonna adjust the time offset to maybe 10, maybe 15. And you can also extend your timeline out to however long you want to watch those dynamics interact. But there, so you can see they're all kind of growing at their own rate. And so you'll also see that maybe these, the animation may look a little strange because you can see some of these as they grow up, they kind of maybe don't bounce exactly how you want them to. So for that, and this looks pretty decent. Maybe we don't need to get into it, but you can keyframe spline dynamics, obviously all these parameters, but when the gravity comes in, when is it going to go to negative 9.81? So you have control over all of that. And you could really have that take effect maybe 20 frames in, so that it starts to fall at the time that you want it to. And maybe it's, when it's growing up like this, it's so stiff and strong because it's much smaller. It wouldn't have as much gravity interacting with it. But as this thing gets heavier and starts to bend outward, gravity takes place and does its thing. But man, I think that's looking good. This is a pretty sweet setup. I like it. Let's get into texturing this and see what we got going on in terms of texture. Yeah, I like that. Yeah, let's move on. So we can just fold these, and we'll start with just one. We can solo it. You don't have to. I'm going to. And what we're going to do is just start a material and add it to our aloe. And the first thing we're going to want to do is go into the color channel and create the main aloe look. Now, what do we have? What is distinct about this plant? You can see that we have these little white kind of splotches everywhere, just scattered about. That is a pretty distinct trait. And you can see them here too. They're a little more pronounced. But the one I have sitting beside me, I don't know, looks a little closer to this. They're all different. But yeah, I mean, I went online, I found different examples, but I also had one here that I could look at and I could touch and just like take a close, examine it very closely to get the information I needed. So I mean, if you're trying to create a photoreal texture, that's definitely something you want to do. Now, that's not always the case for me. I don't always try to do photoreal, but for this, I feel like I wanted to go more in that direction just because of the way these things interact with light. It's really nice, especially if you have one like in front of the window. You can see in the morning, like if the sun's rising, you can see what would be subsurface scattering coming through the other side. It's like a candle or your skin or anything that light can penetrate through. So that was pretty inspiring for me to create something that had those properties. So we're gonna use our color channel first, and we're gonna create a layer. So just under this, toggle down to layer, and that will allow us to have multiple shaders going on. So the first shader we're going to create, so we can get some instant gratification here, is we're going to create those little white splotches. So to do that, we're going to adjust the noise to a displaced Voronoi. So the great thing about this displaced Voronoi is that we can adjust the octaves on it. For these other options, I don't believe they were available. So we want to be able to adjust those octaves just so we can really simplify this thing. Because if you don't know, the more octaves this has, the more complicated of a texture, of a shader it becomes. It adds more octaves, more I guess color values or shades of gray to the mix. So I just scaled that up to illustrate that, but we're going to scale it back down. And we can adjust the low clip and the high clip. So the low clip brings a little more contrast to the darks, and the high clip, same thing, but for the high points. So if we drag the high clip down below the low clip, we're going to start to see the white splotches that we want to see. And they all looked pretty vertical, almost, kind of oval-like. On those examples. So we're just gonna kind of adjust that until we get something, and it could really be anything. It could be far fewer than this, and to adjust that you just adjust the low clip and get rid of some of those, and you could scale it up, change the global scale so that they're all scaling up quite a bit more. I mean, really, I think that's perfect. It's nature, you can't control it. It does its thing. So that's good. And the next thing we want to do is, we don't really see a whole lot of these around the edges on the spikes. Maybe we do, but if you don't want to see them there, what we can do is create a gradient and just drag that below our noise. And what we're going to do is turn this into a layer mask. So you can see already, this is basically masking out what we don't want to see. And so around the edges, maybe we don't want to have as pronounced of those circles. Maybe we want to have them kind of fade out. So we're actually going to do this in 3D linear space, and you'll see that if we do it in the Z direction, it's going to wrap around the object. So right now it's doing it in the X axis. So just to illustrate that really quick, let's turn these deformers off. Take a look at what's going on. And it may be a little hard to see because it's black, but let's see if we can, because we basically want that gradient, and I'll just do it to show you. We want that to wrap around our object in the right way. So if we change it around the Z to -100 and +100, we'll be able to see that. You know what? Let's change the color of this just for illustrative purposes. Oh, you know what? It's layer mask. There we go. Okay. So we can see that it's wrapping now around the Z. It's going around. Starts one side, ends on the other. So anyway, that's exactly what we want it to do. So we're going to go back, change that to black, and change this back to a layer mask. And we're just going to have this black on both sides, white in the center, just so it feathers it out a little bit. And we can bring these in. and also add some turbulence just to vary it up. Take a look. We don't need specular on. And that's looking pretty good. I think pretty decent. It's hard to tell because we don't have any color there yet. So we're going to add our green, and it can be kind of like a pastel green, and just add that to the mix. So then we can see right through it. And I think that looks pretty good. There's, you know, a little variation, they kind of fade out. And if you want more variation, just add more turbulence, really. So these splotches just have kind of more realism to them, because maybe not all of them are perfectly white. So there, that's a pretty good start for the color. Now, before we go any further, let's add an environment to this so that we have something to reflect. It's just going to be very simple, but I just want to make it like a white, or maybe even something slightly, just like a hint of orange. And we can just hide that in the editor view, so we don't have to look at it. It's a little difficult to see. So the next thing we want to do is we can add, let's see, I want to add a little bit of diffusion to this. And so what that's going to do is just, if you take a peek here, you can see that it varies the color all across the surface. So we can just change the black value to, I don't know, like a darker green, so that it blends in better. This can be a little bit larger so that it creates more subtle variation here and there. And it also doesn't have to be as pronounced. Maybe we could do like 50%, just so that there's, you know, it's a very imperfect thing. So that's looking pretty good. And maybe that white doesn't need to be so white. But, you know, we're going in the right direction. So we're going to do, I guess, let's see, bouncing back and forth here, but let's next add a light into our scene. And we're just going to do a simple Omni light, and we're going to bring that back. And I don't know, we're going to put it back here. We want it a little bit low so that we can see some of the subsurface scattering going on, which we're going to add in a moment. But we're gonna, I think we're gonna actually want to increase the intensity. We don't necessarily need to yet, but and you can see when you hit render there, there's definitely no interaction with the light. It's just pure black. So that's why we need some subsurface scattering, so we can see the spill through the object. So we have our light selected, and the only other thing is we're going to change the fall off to something a little more realistic. So once we have that set, we're going to go back into our material and add the reflection. And we want this to just generally reflect some light. We don't want a whole lot of reflection going on, but we're going to add a Fresnel. And we're going to make this super blurry because there aren't any sharp reflections on this object. This is very diffused, very blurry. It's really not helpful right now to preview, but you can see, you know, you just want a pretty soft reflection on this thing. And that may even be a little too blown out for this, but just something there. And that's looking pretty decent. And so the next part we'll just add a bump to this, and the only thing we're going to want, well, we're going to want this original, we don't necessarily need it, but this original noise, the Veroni kind of cellular-like structure. We're going to create another layer and go within that, and actually let's ignore that cellular structure thing, and first choose some displaced turbulence. And what we really want, what's characteristic about a lot of plants, is they have these vertical striations, and you maybe can see it a little bit here, but just their cellular structure, how they grow and how they stay so strong, you can see those striations, which maybe you can see them here a little bit. Yeah. So those vertical strips, pretty characteristic thing. So let's get some of those in there, and we're just gonna scale up the Y axis of this noise to really start getting these vertical stripes. And again, adjust the low clip, the high clip, or just the contrast. But we want to get a lot of darker and lighter, just more contrast in general, so that we can get those stripes there. And so we're just going to change the width of this down to maybe like 20, and maybe that is super narrow. Let's take a look and see what we have. And that may be too narrow, and it may also be that we're just using the standard render, which is just preview, but let's make that a little bit wider. And the other thing, I don't know, maybe it makes sense to do it now, but we're just going to add the stick texture to this, so as it animates, the texture will stick. So let's take a look at the bump and see what we have going on here. There we go, and we have our vertical striations. And so the other thing that I was exploring is we're going to set this up with a bump because we're pretty far away. At least in my example, we're far enough away where displacement isn't really it would be a waste of render time, honestly. But you know, bump is a 2D effect. It's not creating any new geometry. It's just shading it in a way that it helps make it look 3D. And for a lot of cases, that's great. It saves a lot of time in rendering, and that's fantastic. If you want to do any close-up work on these, I would get rid of the bump channel and just copy and paste everything into the displacement. And maybe we can do that real quick, but you'd essentially be copying the whole texture layer, get into displacement. And the other great thing about displacement is that it actually interacts well with subsurface scattering, where it creates the actual displacement in the object. And so the subsurface scattering will take into account those variations where the object dips in and out. But that takes a little time. It definitely looks pretty sweet, and it's something that you should play with for sure. So the other thing we can do here is the same deal for the color. We can copy this gradient layer mask that we chose and add a gradient down here. And paste it and turn it into a layer mask. So now we're just getting it most likely around the edges, and we can just do a preview to check that out. And yeah, you can see that it kind of feathers out around the edges, more striations in the middle. It's looking pretty good. I definitely think that white color it's getting to me. It's a little too much. Tone that down, the gray value, something. It could even have like a tinge of yellowish grayish or something. So yeah, and you know, at any point these can be varied up, they can be changed, so you're not really stuck with anything, which is always a good thing. So the next thing we want to do is add our subsurface scattering, what we've been waiting for here. And this is awesome. I definitely want to, been experimenting with it a lot lately, want to continue. There's lots of great ideas for tutorials using subsurface scattering. It's just, I totally love the effect. But so right now we have the path length, and basically what that does is it looks at the thickness of your object and the light source that you're using, and it's gonna allow the light to pass through certain parts and not pass through other parts. And so the bigger the path length that you have, the more generally it's going to light your object. So if we just choose 20 right now and do a render region, we're going to see that it's generally illuminating that. And you can see the difference between this one and the ones that aren't textured. So we can see that general illumination of the object. So let's bring that down halfway just to take a look and see what's going on. And you can see it's a little bit different. It's a little bit more refined, not as general of an illumination. And if we bring that down to 2, do a preview. And again, as you reduce the path length, animation time or render time is going to increase, but for this case it's still not too bad, and it seems to work out pretty well. So you can see the light is passing through there. It's glowing a little bit around the edges. It could be you know, we could use a little bit more. And so as you decrease the path length, you'll totally get that. So another thing we're lacking is the color, the spill that's coming through. So these red, green, blue values you can adjust. So we want more green coming through. So let's just see what that looks like. And so now it's just letting mostly green through. So we don't even need to change our main color necessarily if we're adjusting down here. So we can play with these values until we're getting something very close to what we want. And as long as the other side of this is looking good, I think that's a pretty good plan. And so we may just add like a darker green to this, or you know, the more pastel-y green, just to kind of darken things up a little bit, but also leave our green that we chose there. So now it's looking a little bit more how it should. It's still glowing quite a bit, and we can decrease the path length to 1 and do a test on that. And that should, you know, start looking a little bit closer to what we're going for here. So it's just calculating. And now this is where you can really start to see, you know, this is looking a lot more like what we want to see. So the lower the path length, probably the better off you're going to get, because now we're starting to see the light coming in just around the edges where it's a lot thinner, but in the thicker portions it's not coming in quite as much. So yeah, I mean, I'm pretty happy with how this is looking. It's definitely along the lines of the preview that I created. So we're just going to go ahead and apply this texture to each one of these. And we're just going to control drag our stick texture, not both textures. and add that to each one. Because sometimes when you're animating and you don't have stick texture on, your texture is going to resize. Not entirely sure if it would for this. I had stick texture on because I did run into some issues. So we're going to leave it on. And let's just do a preview here of what this looks like. And let's render that in our separate window. Just a standard render, something real quick. And while that's going, I'm just going to talk about rendering this animation out. So I ran into some trouble here. And the solution is that in newer versions of Cinema 4D, under Subsurface Scattering, you have a little bit more control over what's going on. So up here, you'll probably see a multiple and a single option. And if you're rendering this out, there's multiple, and within multiple, there are two options. There's direct and cache. So how it works, and from my understanding, is that when you're doing short path lengths, like we are here, you're going to want to use the mode that's direct. So that's more of a brute force way of rendering subsurface scattering. It's going to really tackle it well and pretty much flawlessly with very little error, if any. And if you were to use the cache version, you would want to reserve that for longer path lengths. And that is basically creating small samples throughout your texture, and it's interpolating those throughout the whole piece and rendering it out that way. So, but anyway, for rendering this animation, I would choose direct mode to go with your corresponding short path length, and your animation should render out just perfectly. So we can see that this is coming through here, just kind of a quick render. So we can see a lot of different variation with the color and how the light's hitting it. And you know, you could add a little more light, a little more reflection to some of these. But I mean, this is a little bit different from my example. These colors are a lot more muted, and this also had, you know, some just slight adjustments in post. But this is looking pretty close. And the other thing is, if you wanted to get those white splotches on the other sides, where the subsurface scattering is not picking them up, you can simply take that noise, copy it from your color, and you can go into your luminance, turn this into a layer, add a shader, paste it. We grabbed the wrong one. Hold up. Let me Control Z that because I did something I didn't want to do. So copy that texture from your color and go back to your luminance. Add a whatever, it doesn't matter, and paste that channel. And so now we're gonna screen this on top, and maybe just reduce the percentage so they're pretty subtle popping through. We're not gonna sample all these, but maybe I'll solo the skylight and one of these. So we have that, and that may pick it up, may not, but anyway, it's going to be there. You just may need to increase the intensity of the screen blend mode on that Veroni splotchy texture. But yeah, there it is, and that's way too intense. But that's the beauty of it. You get to go in and adjust things and have a lot of fun when you're doing it. So we'll probably just leave it right there. And, you know, that's something you can play with. You can tweak it. But you basically have all of the big ideas that you need to create this piece here. And if you want to do some close-ups, some, you know, more interaction with the actual volume and subsurface scattering, we can probably get into that on another tutorial. But essentially, yeah, you would just paste all the information in your bump channel, add it to your displacement, and tweak it from there. Your render times are going to increase, but it's totally worth it. You can get some really great results. But anyway, I really appreciate you guys watching. Feel free to stop by Facebook, Instagram, any of the other social media. Mirror Maze will be there. So check us out, and thanks for watching. Stay inspired, keep making cool stuff, and I'll see you next time.